Tamara Halverson and Dr. Jessica Maples-Keller. And we have patient experts Diana Chow and Naomi Mathis. Here's the information if you happen to be just joining us now. But I would like to also introduce two folks who kind of come from the payer slash health system perspective, if you will. And first, I'd like to introduce Marina Saman, who's clinical director at IPD Analytics. They're a group that does wonderful kind of forecasting of the pipeline and works with a broad variety of payers to kind of understand the landscape of how coverage and formulary development will be happening. And so, Marina, thank you for joining us. Anything else you'd want to say in terms of an introduction to you today?
No, thank you for having me.
Okay. And also joining us is Pete Glassman, who is the chair of the medical advisory panel of the VA Pharmacy Benefits Management Services. I've known Pete for a long time. So think of him as the VA. Just think of him as the person who helps the VA figure out what to do with new drugs, and he's seen it all. Pete, how long have you been working in that kind of capacity there?
Let's see, since about 96. So what's that, about 27, 28 years.
There you go. There you go.
I do want to put in a rider that the opinions are my own, not necessarily the position of the VA. But thank you for that, Steve. We have worked together for a while too.
We have. Understood. Okay, so we can get rid of the slide now. And one of the things we like to do is to dive in before we get to some of the issues that people usually want to hear about in terms of coverage policy and payment issues. I want to take that step back again and think about equity and think about this treatment, obviously, in particular. We don't know if it's going to be approved by the FDA, but it kind of allows us to ask ourselves the question, what if it is approved? Or what if something like it is approved? What does the whole system, and by that I mean actual players in the system, what do clinical experts and specialty societies have to do? What do patient advocacy groups need to do? What do health insurers need to do? What do drug makers need to do to really get health equity right? And I'm framing that pretty broadly, but we've talked a fair amount about some of the unmet need issues here. We've talked about the differential needs in some subpopulations of folks. So just thinking broadly, let me actually start with Naomi, if you don't mind. Naomi, if you could wave a wand and something like this, and again, we can move beyond now. Our purpose here is not to relitigate the data issues. So we're looking forward and thinking conceptually where necessary. So if we're thinking about this treatment or treatments like this, what do you think needs to change or to be done to make sure that as it gets introduced, we get it right?
Thank you, Stephen, for asking me that question, because I think it's so important. I think if I was queen for a day and had a magic wand, I would say that the VA would have the infrastructure that would be able to give veterans first class, evidence-based treatment. I think they would have enough mental health providers. I think I would want the cost to be to where it is accessible, both not just in the VA healthcare system, but for our rural veterans that are out there that may have to, with no other choice, rely on community care, and VA would, having to put the cost out for that. So, the current protocol calls for 2 therapists for this this therapy, and some veterans can't even get 1 therapist to get conventional treatment currently. And so, I think the regulatory framework needs to be hashed out, but if if this could be done, I think that this is what I would want. I would want it to look like.
Are there special steps that you can imagine to take to help BIPOC communities have better access to this? Let's assume again that something like this is broadly accessible. The usual experience in most countries, not just the US, is that the more plugged in, wealthier, and usually white people get access to the new things differentially. If we were trying to make this a test case of doing it differently, any thoughts on how that could be effectively done?
You know, DAV is really committed to ending racial disparities in health outcomes. But I would say that outreach is going to be vital, particularly when it comes to communities such as those that have been marginalized, such as your Indian, American Indian and Native Alaskan veterans. That's going to be key. Outreach, education, and I think reaching across to different federal agencies, such as the Indian Health Service, is going to be key. You know, Medicaid, Social Security, you know, and so forth. So, but education, I think, really is also going to be key in letting them know, like, you know, this is something that, I mean, the whole of it all, not just that this is something that can help you, but why and how. This is not opioids, that, you know, and really explaining that, and volunteers, getting the community involved in all of this, and having some really excellent ambassadors that can speak to these communities about the care that they can get at VA.
Diana, I bet you're chomping at the bit to have something to say here too, but I also just wanted to share a brief memory I had that was related to something Naomi was saying. I remember back in the relatively early days of the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco, they were trying to figure out how to reach and to mobilize people to, in a sense, self-identify as being at risk. And they had the way that, if you will, doctors think about it. You know, you're at risk. You should, you know, if you do blank, blank, and blank, you should come forward. And they realized that they were completely not connecting with a large part of the Latino community in San Francisco. So they did focus groups, and they found that in that community, for many, especially young men, protecting their family was far more important than protecting themselves and their parents. So they changed their messaging, and they went back out to that community with basically a protect your family, you know, and your parents. And it really drove up engagement and screening and that kind of thing. So since we've heard that PTSD is a condition in which people often hesitate to self-identify and come in for screening or treatment, it seems like that could be another thing we're going to have to think about, is how do we, if you will, put ourselves inside the heads of people with PTSD who come from different communities and might need to hear a different message. So, not that I'm trying to put words in your mouth, Diana, but this is the world that you really live in. So what would you say if you could wave your magic wand and try to make the introduction, let's just say, of psychedelic treatment? Let's say that we can figure out how to make it effective and safe and, you know, other things, and we'll come back to that. But, you know, what would it take to do it right in terms of getting the equity angle right?
Yeah, and you know, I think Naomi said so many things that I would have said. So I was very happily not jumping out of it because I was just like nodding along. But you know, to your point, I just want to give a very real example of that. My own, a lot of my own experiences of trauma came from within my family. And when I first started speaking out about my experiences, I was shocked because I would go to an audience that is practically all white, and they would come up to me and tell me, "Oh, Diana, you are so brave for sharing your story. Thank you." And then one time I gave a speech to an audience of all immigrant parents, Asian immigrant parents across Asian diaspora. And they went up to my mother and said, "You are so brave for letting your child ruin your family's name." This is what this is the difference, you know. So for me, I know I'm just giving one example, but I really want to highlight how deep and ingrained this sort of thing is. And so that's one of the reasons why, when I mentioned earlier, like, of course, we want to see treatment that can finally bring relief to so much pain. But that definitely has to have that cultural understanding of shame and attached to it, understood in the education. And part of that is one thing that I found to be quite helpful in this regard is to recognize the intergenerational levels of trauma at play here, and to give the older generation as well permission to acknowledge that some of the shame that they might feel that might prevent them from seeking this, or prevent them from letting their children who are growing up as young adults to seek this, is because of the shame they feel themselves for having experienced something like this. And related to that, I think I was coming to this really grateful to ICER for including my perspective on this, because I think oftentimes younger folks with PTSD are often dismissed or not included in these conversations because people think, oh, what could you possibly have experienced? And that's obviously, we see with data that young to middle-aged adults are at higher prevalence of PTSD than older adults, but also beyond that, as trauma treatment approaches change, the way trauma happens also changes. And we see things like revenge porn, and nowadays with AI deepfakes, and even digital self-harm where kids are cyberbullying themselves. These are things that young people are more vulnerable to, and can lead to the importance of understanding these topics and discussions in more age inclusive ways. So I know we're talking about adults here, so that's why I'm focusing on the young adult population specifically, but I just wanted to say that if I had, the ability to decide how this goes, I would really be inclusive about those different dialogues and bring the intergenerational dialogue as part of that destigmatizing, de-shaming conversation.
Thank you. That's just really, really insightful. Well, let me then throw it over to the system guy, Pete. So you're the VA. I know you're not representing the VA, but let's pretend like you are. No, I'm kidding. Whatever you need to do in terms of disassociating yourself from being an official spokesperson from the VA. But the VA's got to be thinking about this, right? And I know you probably know about the study that they're kind of, I don't actually know if it's formally launched yet or if it's just under planning. But think if you can tell us where the VA is on this MDA AP, if you will, idea, and just again, generally, how can the VA think about introducing a treatment for PTSD that might have a new mechanism of action and introduce it in a way that you think will do the best at addressing equity issues?
That's a lot to answer. I'll see if I can break it into. I want to deal with the equity issue though, because I think Naomi and Diana really brought up some very interesting questions and some very interesting points. Let me deal with that first, actually, because we're there. When I look at equity across the system, I actually think in terms of different levels, not just racial, gender, ethnic, but also other socio-determinants such as rurality or rural versus urban, and who's going to and how people get access to it. And that the VA is obviously a huge healthcare system extending from across the United States. So we have to try to figure out how to provide this to veterans in various locales across the US. But I also think in terms of the dynamic of the VA in the greater healthcare system. So for example, when we look at the resources that are required or will be required if this gets approved, the therapists, et cetera, for example, just take the therapists alone and the number of that will need to get trained, that will have to be paid for, and those folks will need to undertake that training, which is my understanding is it's quite a lot of hours just to train. But we also exist in the middle of all this private healthcare, and there's going to be a lot of private healthcare that's going to want to provide this as well to their patients, maybe to veterans as well. They're going to be grabbing for these therapists as well. They want those therapists to be able to be in there. So we're going to be, if you will, competing for similar resources, human resources in this case. So there's the dynamic of equity within the healthcare system at large. And then within the VA, of course, there's the issues that we're brought up by Naomi and Diana. In terms of what the VA is doing, I am not the expert in it. I have had to rely on others to give me more information. I'm not particularly, I don't know the details of the MDMA study that you're talking about, but I do have notes around here that the VA has been involved in looking at this since 2023, and they have a group that's looking at this in 4 different ways or 4 different angles. One is research. The second is clinical implementation. The third is training. And the fourth is informatics and evaluation, which will include monitoring. So if you think about how the healthcare system at large is going to work at this, VA anyway, I believe, is that not only do you have different categories that have to be dealt with, and by the way, this is going to probably be a model for other psychedelics and similar, such as psilocybin.
Right.
But you also have to have groups that are looking at particular aspects of it, and they have to be collaborative within VA. So we have to be talking to other people. You can't just have a formulary decision. You have to have decisions with your mental health professionals, et cetera, et cetera. So it's going to be a large-scale collaborative system-wide effort, and it's going to assume that the infrastructure is going to take time, and some places will have it up and running sooner than others. So these are all things that have to be considered as we move forward with this. Again, assuming that this one gets approved, which is still up as a question.
I want to come back with another question about the VA in a second, but I wanted to make sure Jessica or you, or if you have anything that you might want to add. Again, I'm handing out magic wands today. So what would yours look like in order for equity to be a key feature of the rollout of a new treatment like this?
Yeah, I have lots of dreams with a magic wand in this area. I've been doing some work with Dr. Sierra Carter at Georgia State, looking at perceptions of MDMA and psilocybin therapy, specifically in the Black community. We work in an area, Grady Hospital, that serves an area of Atlanta where, kind of referring to our conversation earlier about disproportionate impact of PTSD on BIPOC populations, this community, epidemiologically 1 in 3 has a lifetime history of PTSD. So just shocking rates of PTSD and trauma exposure. So we've been doing some mixed methods work. A national survey looking at interest in these. So we looked at a group of white Americans and Black Americans, and with a very brief online psychoeducation, both groups increased in their interest in the treatments, and the Black Americans even more so. So I think that echoes Naomi's point that we need to be doing outreach, and we need to be doing that proactively in advance of a large scale rollout, and not kind of waiting and doing it in response, in which case we know there's going to be huge inequities in access. We also ask people about barriers to these treatments, and over 50% of people report significant barriers. So I think that's something that's important to remember, is that not only do we need to make sure that insurance and different things cover it so that the treatment isn't prohibitively expensive, we also need to make sure that the systems are set up to where people can actually do these treatments. So it requires additional screening, multiple time points. It requires full day sessions, and those are hard things to do. So things like, can you offer flexible appointments, flexible timing? Can you offer childcare on site? Can you do virtual appointments when necessary, so that, lower income and other marginalized groups are not disproportionately not able to access these, even if they have coverage.
Right.
And then also, I think another big one is being culturally informed, having culturally informed models of MDMA therapy. So one thing we've been doing focus groups with the Grady community that's really come out is the importance of information and trust. So not only individual trust, but community level trust, that are you actually engaged with this community that you're trying to get to engage in these novel treatments, providing appropriate information and informed consent, especially in groups that have been mistreated in psychedelic research. So we know from reviews of early wave psychedelic research that minoritized groups were regularly mistreated in early wave psychedelic research. So being aware of the historical context and making sure people actually know what they're kind of consenting to and thinking of consent as an ongoing process. And then I think also training diverse providers, and setting up the infrastructure to have access to clinics that serve diverse groups. So there's a kind of high barrier to high kind of entry into being able to do this. There's all the regulations on providing MDMA, the medical screening needed on site, the training in the therapist. So for some clinics, that's also disproportionately hard to add in. So how can we make sure that clinics are also supported and given the resources they need that serve more diverse communities and able to, in order to be able to provide these treatments?
That's great. You are anything you'd like to?
These are really interesting points made by Jessica, I have to say. And somehow you could say, me coming from Norway, I already have the magic wand, given our governmental pension fund. But even though we have a lot of resources in Norway, I'm still quite concerned regarding the resource and cost-demanding nature of this treatment.
Yeah.
So when it comes to equity, I think we need to think about which patient groups can benefit the most from this treatment if it's approved by the regulatory governments, because honestly, I don't think that all patients will have access to a treatment that is so resource demanding and costly as MDMA assisted therapy seems to be.
Thanks. Marina, I'm going to come to you, don't worry, but I'm going to pivot back to the VA for a second. And again, just thinking broadly, it feels like MDMA, and I'm just creating a picture here that I'm sure the company would not appreciate, to be honest, but it feels like 84 hours of therapist time, multiple dosing, 8-hour treatment days. That feels like a Cadillac, as we used to say. It feels like, wow, that is just, it's exquisite, it's huge, it's expensive, and it comes to the VA. Do you think the VA would just try to, and let's assume that something like that gets FDA approved, and you look at the clinical trial and that's the way they did the therapy. Do you think the VA would say, well, we're not going to do it that way. We're going to take MDMA and we're going to try one therapist and we're going to try 44 instead of 84 hours. I mean, there's just, because if we try to do it the other way, we're going to blow out our mental health kind of personnel budget, or we can't do that, certainly in the short term. So what are the options looking like for the VA to do something as a almost off-label form of, you substitute something else in instead of the Lykos version? Are you familiar with any kind of experience that would suggest that that's likely or unlikely to happen?
My opinion?
Yeah.
In short, is no. It's not going to happen. I don't think so. I really believe that, at least initially, would be this is my gut feeling anyway. At least initially, you'd follow the protocols that were already established to show benefit, because as soon as you go off label or you start using a single therapist versus two therapists, I mean, there's the whole issue that we heard earlier about the concerns that were brought up about therapeutic misconduct, which were frightening to say the least, as well as from the safety perspective, and then you have the efficacy perspective, since it's a bundled product, which isn't something we usually have seen before, as far as I know. I think you go with that bundled product. I would say, however, there are two things I want to highlight. One, there may be an unexpected benefit of a novel agent, even though it starts, people hear about it, they come in and they start therapy that they've never had before. Maybe they don't get MDMA because that might not be appropriate for them, but they open up about their PTSD from their combat experience, for example. And so we bring them into the system, and they start getting therapy, which I think would be a wonderful thing. But I would say the short answer has to be, in the short term, no. However, all these things are dynamic. And my guess is, although we start with quite, if you will, a bulky infrastructure, human as well as observational, over time, my thought would be that the company and others will find ways to shorten it, because they'll want to have the most effective and expedited treatment that they can have to bring in more people. I may be wrong, but I think protocols will probably get better over time. That's my
Okay.
guess.
Well, we're kind of shifting out of the equity focus, if you will, and more into just general implementation issues. But I want to continue on this vein of, and Naomi, I see you. So just to invite others to start to think about issues around implementation of a new kind of treatment option like this, and what, you know, because one of the other things that we obviously are going to have to talk about is if the risk of abuse is a significant issue in everybody's mind, how does system implementation address that? Is it 3 therapists instead of 2? Is it requiring videotaping of every session? Is it some kind of narrow centers of excellence approach where you only work with a very small network of doctors who you trust completely, or whatever it's going to look like? We're going to get there. But Naomi, let me let you comment on my question that I asked Pete.
Yes, I just wanted to add something. One is that VA has done really well at keeping the VSOs involved.
Sorry,
so
VSO for people.
I'm sorry,
who are...
veteran service organizations involved, such as DAV, Disabled American Veterans. So they've done a really good job at keeping the veterans involved from the process, from the beginning. And while we are VA's biggest champions, and we believe that they do provide high quality first-class healthcare, I'll tell you why that won't happen. It won't happen because they have stakeholders like us, the DAV, or the veteran service organizations, to answer to, which is their client. I mean, you know, they wouldn't be able to just go off label like that and potentially cause harm like that, because that's why we're here. We're their biggest watchdog as well.
Well, the funny thing, if you will, now just to drop back into the evidence for a second, but the issue came up that the LSNAP, I think that's the acronym for their version of the psychotherapy component, is not one of the kind of accepted evidence-based modular approaches. So let's say that Jessica hangs out her shingle and says, well, this has been approved with kind of a carnival show. I'm just making this up again. I want to market my clinical services as MDMA plus CBT, or MDMA plus TPF. I'm using other acronyms now. That's the trauma. Sorry, what is TPF again? Or is it TFP? Trauma-focused psychotherapy. Yeah, I think I got my own acronym wrong. So, and Marina, I will turn to you in a second here too, because if you're thinking like all the different health plans out there in the world, are you looking for clinical experts to come forward with a more cost-effective version of this with the same core drug element? Or are you also just going to say, nope, we're going to stick with what was in the clinical trial and we're not going to do anything else until there's a different indication or a different option? So first, Jessica, would you want to, I mean, you're doing research on it, so maybe it's an unfair question, but would you want to try to propose to a payer, I want to take your patient and help them, but I want to do my version of psychotherapy with MDMA and not that Lykos thing?
Yes, that's the work I'm doing, and that's what I would propose is, you know, we're doing this model because we believe that it's going to be beneficial in lots of ways. Obviously, the data collection's ongoing, so we'll see how our data looks. But yeah, that's what we would propose, is doing MDMA in combination with prolonged exposure, like we're doing in this pilot study, and hopefully testing it in RCT next.
Okay, so Marina.
Yes.
Any appetite for little creativity around the psychotherapy module here, or not at launch?
So I think so. A couple things. I think with MDMA AP, the FDA acknowledged in their draft guidance that it complicates matters, that this is a drug tied to a therapy. So I believe you called it a package deal. That makes things a little complicated because, you know, the FDA regulates the drug, and then at the state level, then the therapies or therapists, you know, psychiatrists are going to be regulated. That's very different. So from a payer perspective, all of the clinical concerns that were discussed in the first part of the meeting, payers have those same clinical concerns when we kind of look at some of the data from our survey around PTSD. Operational concerns are big ones. The biggest one for payers is trying to figure out which therapists are appropriately certified to administer the therapy. So I don't think initially there's any appetite to do anything too creative. Probably the big question I have is, what will the labeling look like? Is Lykos going to update their manual to account for things like group therapy, which wasn't studied in the clinical trials? Peter, the VA does have a clinical trial looking at group therapy, and there was a pharmacoeconomic analysis published last year talking about, that's one of the ways to decrease costs, because obviously the therapist cost with this with MDMA AP is so large. So I think that's something that's really interesting, but I think from a payer perspective, it's going to be very narrow in terms of the criteria that are developed based on the labeling. I'm assuming there will be a very stringent REMS in place. And so just thinking about all of that. And I also think if there's if you're a behavioral health vendor, this is your time to shine, because you're going to have to figure out how to identify these therapists and where are they. And, this is a huge opportunity to kind of grow your network, because everyone's going to be scrambling to figure out how to equitably provide this to appropriate patients. And again, just to echo everyone's sentiments related to patients in rural communities, that's a huge concern. Just like, as a pharmacist, I think about pharmacy deserts. There are therapist deserts where, there are no psychiatrists there, and what do those patients do? So some thoughts.
We could ask that question today, couldn't we? There's so many problems accessing psychiatrists, at least for a lot of this. So let's talk about the certification, and again, linking it to the idea that there's a natural tension. Let's say whether it's payers or health systems, if they want to try to make access better, they're going to want as many providers trained and ready to do this, but they want to have some really good quality control here, if only because of the stories and the problems that have been identified in today's meeting and in other sources. They're going to be very worried probably about incorporating any kind of new network or new providers, or even their current providers. It may raise all kinds of questions. So the company itself is creating a certification program. Are there other models, Jessica, or Naomi or Diana? Would it be better for the APA, the American Psychiatric Association, to do this certification? Do you think individual payers should run a certification process? This is going to be a big question for, I think, a lot of groups. So how do we do that right? Go ahead.
I think it depends on future research, because an open question here is, why do we have to combine MDMA with this LSNAP psychotherapy component? Why not use MDMA as an augmentation for already existent evidence-based treatments? So let's just say that the Jessica's trial is positive. Perhaps we can use the training methods that is already in place for prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, in combination with some extra training to give MDMA as well.
So I'm assuming, tell me if you think I'm wrong, let's just assume that if this is approved, the FDA label will talk about it's being used in conjunction with the Lykos psychotherapy, but a psychiatrist could write a prescription for the pill and again, tell the insurer I'm doing it as part of a different form of therapy. And no one's ever going to go out and get a new label. There's not going to be a new company that's going to come along and try to rebrand this with a different form of psychotherapy. And so my thinking is that whatever, let's say Jessica's research study is flagrantly positive, it works fantastically. What then? there's not going to be a new FDA decision. There's no company will step forward. The only thing that might change, I suppose, are psychiatric guidelines, clinical guidelines or something.
I think that's a really good and pertinent question. But I also think that you can always prescribe a medicine off-label. So if FDA combines MDMA with the LSNAP condition, couldn't a psychiatrist prescribe MDMA off-label and then combine it with another existent evidence-based treatment?
So Marina, back to you, I suppose. This is kind of a repeat of my original question, but with the extra kicker that let's assume that if months have passed after the FDA approval and Jessica's study is published in the New England Journal of Medicine, right? Knock on wood. And everybody says, well, what now? But how do you think the plans, their P&T committees or whoever it would be, because the drug, anyway, it raises an interesting question here because the package deal is now at question, at issue.
No, it's a great question. And I think it all comes down to what does the label look like? So does the label just say assisted therapy, assisted psychotherapy? Can the FDA stipulate LSNAP or, whatever? I think that's a really big question. If it's stipulated in the label that it has to be this particular therapy, I think that's what payers are going to use. If it just says assisted therapy, and then there's some kind of, I don't know what, addendum in the REMS or who knows what, then I think it's a great question. And I think that's one of the big concerns is you don't want, you'll have some very high quality psychiatrists doing very rigorous, by the book therapy. And then you will have people in their garage administering, therapy. And that's the big fear that you lose control of that if we don't have good data, if we don't have, control of that. So I think it comes down to the label, to be quite honest.
And let me just touch again on the earlier point that you raised about the health plans trying to figure out what their network looks like for this and how they certify people. So again, Lykos will have its approach. I'm just assuming for the sake of our fleshing this out that if Lykos's approach is FDA approved, Lykos will certify clinicians. Is there a reason to have alternative voices certifying clinicians for this? Would it be wise for someone else other than the company to be in charge of certifying clinicians for any number of reasons? Jessica, what do you think?
Well, given the patient testimonies that we heard earlier today, I would say that it would be a very wise decision to have others to provide training in different psychotherapy modalities that could go along with MDMA as well.
Can somebody else just step up and say, I can teach LSNAP as well as they can, so let some other group certify me in doing it? I don't want to have to do it with them, but I don't actually, here's where I don't know the actual technique well enough to know if it's clear enough that someone can just read the cookbook and say, I can get trained in that, or I can train somebody in that. Do you guys know?
Yeah, I've read the manual, the MAPS manual for MDMA assisted psychotherapy. And my reading is that it's, let's say it's far less structured than the usual manuals we use in psychotherapy research. Yeah.
Far less structured. Okay. Jessica, do you have any thoughts about this certification question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the regulatory side of things, but I think this does go back to Marina's answer that it will likely depend on the specifics of what the FDA says. But I agree. I think it's beneficial, ideally it's beneficial to have multiple models and multiple organizations that can train and not only train and kind of certify kind of like a check mark, but provide ongoing oversight. So kind of oversight of therapist behavior in, processes for patients to file concerns or complaints with different organizations.
Do the specialty societies currently do anything like that for any version of psychotherapy? do they own a kind of a certification process themselves? American Psychoanalytic Society. I mean, someone must hand out cards saying you're certified to do this version of therapy.
Some specific treatments have like, where you can be like a registered, certified, kind of like you have completed their training requirements for a specific treatment modality. That doesn't mean that you're required to do that in order to do that in clinical practice. You're guided more by like, you are supposed to have an internal compass around your competency and your training and ability to administer an intervention. But some specific ones do have, like this is what you need to be kind of like a certified provider in this area. And in any way people can access that information.
Marina, I was going to come back to you anyway. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was thinking, so I love this question, and I kind of wonder if and again, depends on the labeling, but I wonder if the Lycos certification could be almost like a baseline, and then the APA or someone else could have this additional certification. And then as a payer or a behavioral health vendor, or even like if the VA has some sort of certification, I almost feel like whatever the VA does is going to kind of be the gold standard for what everyone else does. But I'm kind of thinking there could be something in addition to the Lycos certification that payers could lean on to say, our providers that provide this not only have the baseline certification, but they need to have this additional step. Of course, every additional step we add decreases the amount of patients that will have access to therapy. But I think at the end of the day, we all want, high quality and kind of some safety controls in place.
Yeah.
And that's something that we, again, with Magic Wand have hoped that we would be able to do in the future. It's like, maybe it's required you do an MDMA specific therapy training. And then there's a lot of providers who are already trained in prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy. So then maybe we provide a, add-on training that is, how do you integrate MDMA therapy with prolonged exposure therapy for people who are trained in both of those? So as Marina said, it is a lot of training and it does add up. But that's definitely a model that I would see a lot of benefit for, and it then expands opportunity to actually, do future research looking at these, different therapeutic models combined with MDMA.
Maybe 20 years from now, there'll be psychiatric boards in psychedelic therapy, a completely different testing and trial process. Pete, you raised your hand. The gold standard will be at the VA. Get it right. Oops, you're on mute.
I heard that, and thank you, Marina. I appreciate the sentiment. I was just going to say, because it's a bundle, it's in Lycos's or the company's best interest to expand training as fast as possible, because if you don't do that, they can't use the drug. And if you can't use the drug, they won't make any money. So it's in their best interest to farm out training, however it's defined, whatever that baseline is, as fast as possible if they want to bring in more money. So I'd say the incentive is on them to increase the pool of people that can be trained, as well as the pool of trainers.
And that was, again, casting no aspersions specifically to people at Lycos, but the general incentive, as you said, might lead one to worry about their standards for that certification. If they're trying to expand as quickly as possible, maybe maybe it's good to have somebody else looking over their shoulder, to have a secondary certification like Jessica mentioned, or Marina. And I think that is another way that payers might think of managing this very tightly at the beginning, is to manage the provider certification piece. We'll come to the patient selection piece in a sec. Diana, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's really great to hear the conversation about bringing different modalities of psychotherapy, because that is one of the huge aspects of equity as well, to make sure that people have a choice in what sort of format of treatment works best for them. Even with just like CBT, for example, which oftentimes can take on a more individual focused approach for someone from a collective oriented background, that type of approach can feel very it's hard to connect to it versus something that might be more psychosomatic based. So perhaps EMDR, where there's more physical recognitions of symptoms of distress and things like that. So that's where that is really helpful from an equity perspective as well. And I also want to say that, with these sorts of psychedelics related treatment, we've seen a rise in people looking towards traditional indigenous methods that, like for example, ayahuasca, which has psychedelic properties that are oftentimes misused or taken out of the traditional context. And so when we look at these types of newer treatments, it would, I think, benefit a lot of us as well to look at where this might have been done in the past in different ways, and to appreciate people's knowledge on those topics when they're already the experts.
Yeah, very good point. Okay, I think I want to move on to a couple of other issues quickly before we get to coverage policy, just some of the specifics around the patient selection, and it'll have a kind of connection with some of these earlier issues too. But I wanted to bring back up again the idea of clinical guidelines. We often find that when new treatments, especially new paradigms of treatment, are coming in, specialty societies, some are all teed up and ready to go and have a clinical guideline ready on day one. And others are completely passive, and for historical or other reasons. And we find that what many of them don't know is how closely health plans look for clinical guidelines to help guide their coverage policy, especially, well, always, but especially, I guess, in the early days. So again, if we make a recommendation, I just want to make sure that you guys don't think it's off base, or if you have anything to add. I think it would be very helpful for the American Psychiatric Association to try to speed up their process for creating some kind of clinical guideline around the use of these types of treatments as they enter practice in general. Do they have a subcommittee of the guidelines group already formed around psychedelics? Do they have interest groups at the APA? I mean, what's your guys' experience with the likelihood of there being a rapid guideline follow-on to any FDA approval? Any ideas? No? Okay. I can't remember the last time. So, I mean, there was ketamine, right? Spravato. So how long did it, any idea how long it took once that was approved before there was a guideline around it from the APA? You guys read those clinical guidelines each night before you go to bed? I can tell now. Well, I think we can make a recommendation that, again, specialty societies think that they're talking to their own brethren, to their own practitioners, but they're also talking to insurers and health systems. And so clinical guidelines can be very, very helpful around patient selection, monitoring, that kind of stuff. All right, back over to the payer world. Marina, how are payers going to pay for this? It's all going to depend on the label. All right, we know that, right? But can you imagine they're going to pay for this as a package deal to a provider? Are they going to pay separately for the drug on their formulary and then just pay, CPT hours of therapy? Any guidance on how you think they're going to approach the payment structure here?
Yeah, so it kind of seems like payers are still figuring this out and trying to figure out if the drug will be paid on the pharmacy benefit and the therapy on the medical benefit, or obviously I would imagine that this drug will be directly supplied to the provider through a limited number of pharmacies, and so it could all be on the medical benefit. So I think it remains to be seen again what the labeling looks like, but I do think, unfortunately, there will likely be like a dual approval process or tied together, but I think it's going to be really difficult just because you've got the initial approval of the drug tied to therapy with only certain therapists that can provide that therapy, and it makes it very difficult, which again, this is just me, I really feel like this is a great opportunity for a behavioral health vendor or someone to manage that process because it is so difficult and different and new. But short answer, I think that everyone's trying to figure that out. And I think it all comes down to what does the labeling look like and what does the REMS, well, I assume, what does the REMS say? I mean, they haven't said there's a REMS, but I just think we all assume there will be one.
There was a REMS with Spravato too, I'm pretty sure, right? So are there any lessons learned from how that was paid for by insurers? I mean, similar kind of paradigm shifting treatment, obviously. Psychiatrists weren't used to having people camped out getting IV treatments. So what do you think there's any lessons to be learned from Spravato here?
I think, well, I would say that maybe the biggest lesson to be learned, is that some forward thinking and planning is needed. And we need good data collection to figure out who is our patient population, who are these providers, where are the places that, where we assume this will be administered. And then I think just understanding, I mean, my assumption is it will be a slow burn. It's not going to be like huge bolus of patients all at once. It's going to be kind of a slow uptake. And so I do think we'll have some time to kind of iron out the kinks, but I do think it's going to be kind of a rough start when this, should this product be approved.
So maybe clinical experts repeat, when Spravato was approved, was there a bit of a warehousing effect where there was a big surge in interest at the very beginning, or was it a slow uptick all the way through? I have no knowledge of this. Do you know? No, I don't either.
Not sure. I would assume that with any new agent such as Spravato, I'm sure there were people that were warehoused to a certain degree because there are certainly treatment-resistant depression, but I don't know the numbers.
By the way, I hope warehouse doesn't come across as a dismissive term. It's just a term meaning that people are kind of waiting with pent-up interest in something, watching it, and the second it's FDA approved, there's kind of a surge. The first time I heard that was around hepatitis C treatments. And again, we haven't had something really new or helpful for PTSD in so long. I can't imagine that there are a fair number of patients who are closely watching this. And so we might see, I would think, at least some spike of interest at the beginning. Okay, so let's drop into just some of the nuts and bolts, because one of the things that will also be done along with figuring out which providers is that insurers will have to say, what's the clinical criteria for coverage for patients, for individual patients? And the usual approach is to cut and paste certainly the FDA label, but if the FDA label is too broad, they may also use the clinical trial eligibility criteria to be more specific about which patients. So I'm staring at the clinical trial eligibility things here, and it's stuff like a CAPS-5 score of greater than or equal to 28. They can't have uncontrolled hypertension. They can't have a baseline prolongation of their QT-QTC interval, which might mean you have to submit an EKG. There's an interesting thing that they can't have evidence or history of significant medical disorders, which just kind of stood out to me as like, wow, what is, I'm not sure. And Naomi, I think in some prior conversation, you wondered, how are patients with clinical comorbidities, heart conditions, et cetera? I mean, how do you make sure that the right patients are getting this? And there's, they can't be abusing illegal drugs. Sometimes that's made part of clinical trials just to make sure that the effects of the treatment isn't being affected or masked in some way. But I could imagine a payer saying, okay, we'll include that, and they need drug screening to qualify for treatment. Clinical experts, do you have any specific concerns about any of the inclusion or exclusion criteria from the trial in terms of their being used by payers to try to make sure that appropriate patients are treated? And then we'll get to the issue of step therapy after that.
I think the exclusion criteria in both MAP1 and MAP2 were quite broad. So you mentioned a few of the exclusion criteria. An exclusion criteria I didn't mention, Stephen, was personality disorder. And we know that approximately 1 in 2 patients who qualify for PTSD also qualify for a personality disorder. So I think the exclusion criteria were quite broad. And if you look at the exclusion rates, I think that in the first phase 3 trial, MAP1 trial, the exclusion rate was over 90%. And
Wow.
in the second phase 3 trial, I think the exclusion rate almost, or it neared 70%. So the patients going into these trials are quite few.
So just to be clear, do you think that having a personality disorder is a contraindication to this form of therapy and treatment?
I wouldn't say neither yes or no, because I don't know MDMA-assisted psychotherapy good enough. But I just note that personality disorder was an exclusion criteria in both the phase 3 trials.
Okay. Jessica, did you want to opine on that?
Yeah, I'll echo your. So it is important to just note that there is a lot of exclusion criteria, both medical and psychological. So I think that's an important thing to remember, as you were saying, like there probably would be a lot of people very excited for this treatment. So I think in messaging, making sure people are aware that there are other effective treatments that exist, because people will be deemed ineligible for this. And that's tough when it's a treatment that people have a lot of hope around potentially. And so a couple others I would mention too is the exclusion criteria included like pretty elevated suicidality and moderate or severe substance use disorder. And those are also things that are pretty comorbid with PTSD. So that's something else to be aware of, is that when we think about the risk benefit from the phase 3 data, we want to make sure we're remembering what that sample is, and that like if those things are loosened, that potentially, you know, there could be more risk, but obviously we need data to speak to that and see if that would be the case.
Got it. Marina, any comment from your perspective on how plans will take a look at these criteria and use them in their coverage? Again, we're all of this under the assumption that hypothetically, and it could be this treatment, it could be a different treatment, but we're going to have, you know, other potential psychedelic type treatments. So what do you think they'd do with the clinical trial criteria?
Right. I think that you're right. Normally you take the clinical trial criteria and it's almost not like a cut paste, but you're going to follow it very closely. PTSD is a little different. So I think that really for the majority of payers, and you will have payers that are going to be obviously have very strict criteria. I think you're going to look for, you know, patients that have tried and failed, or, you know, that this will be considered more of a third or a fourth line therapy. They're going to require documentation of, you know, moderate to severe PTSD. So if that means submitting a CAPS-5 score or just clinical notes, that could be part of it. They're going to require, you know, some kind of documentation that, you know, the assisted therapy is being done by a psychiatrist, I would imagine, or a behavioral health provider with expertise in PTSD. So some kind of, you know, again, and it all comes down to then there'll be the added, you know, I guess, some kind of provision or list that that provider is certified to, you know, administer MDMA AT. And then I imagine that payers will require past or current, you know, trauma-focused therapy or some other, you know, just trying therapy or something before. And then a majority of the payers that we surveyed said that they will require step through one or more SSRIs or an SNRI. About half of them indicated that they would require, you know, trying a generic atypical antipsychotic. And then of course there'll be quantity limits. So I don't think that some of the exclusion criteria from the clinical trials will be that you'll see a lot of in clinical payer criteria, just because of the nature of the disease.
They may, again, this is a stereotype or generalization, but if they do a lot of step therapy, they may feel like they don't have to be quite as specific about the individual patient clinical characteristics. Because they'll use a different way to try to make sure that the right patients are getting treated. I will come back to some more questions about step therapy, but let me make sure that Diana gets a chance.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say that, you know, because we're talking about the whole issue of diagnostic criteria and just like exclusion in general, the whole issue that I want to raise is like the diagnosis of PTSD itself, because of several things. One, I myself was diagnosed with bipolar disorder first when I was younger. And then later on in my life, I was told that actually it's very likely that I was having PTSD, but it was misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder. And a lot of this had to do in part with the fact that the first therapist I saw was very much culturally not competent and dismissed many of my concerns as not something she understood, so she didn't understand the traumatic aspect of it. Second thing about that is also the fact that like in the DSM, right, like the whole culture bound syndromes are just in the relegated to the appendix of the book. And if you're talking about symptoms that happen particularly within minority groups, one group at a time or whatever, to qualify as these culture bound syndromes, there should be theoretically hundreds of those, but there's only 6 like acknowledged in the appendix of this huge diagnostic manual. And so a lot of those symptoms that are a lot of those syndromes that are acknowledged have overlapping symptoms with PTSD as the way we understand it. And so I do want to bring like, just I know this is slightly out of the scope of the question, but just in the context of how do we decide who gets a treatment? How do we decide who qualifies as someone who suffers from PTSD in the first place? Is that an equitable approach? That's just something I think is worth thinking about.
We'll have to make sure we find a place to make that point, because I just skipped over the diagnostic part. I went straight to severity based on a CAPS score, but I can see your point. If you don't get the diagnosis right at the outset, that's a disaster for everybody. And the cultural aspects are very, very interesting for sure. Okay, that's great. Let's talk just a tiny bit more about step therapy, because I think I came away from reading the report and talking to the staff with the idea that if health plans said before you get to approval for MDMA AP, you should have a certified therapist provide you with short-term trauma-focused psychotherapy with an acknowledged effective module. And yet we've heard that the access to that is pretty limited. And so I want to hear your thoughts on whether so I'm a health plan or whatever, let's think about the generic health plan. Should they go ahead and do that? Would that be actually one way to enhance outcomes, to have people flow through that kind of first line of therapy before they would get a chance at MDMA focused therapy? Is that the right way to structure insurance coverage to get the best clinical outcomes? It's a loaded question, but what do you guys think? Yor, go ahead.
I would say that we need more data to answer your question. So we need more randomized controlled trials, specifically recruiting patients who have tried previous treatments and not responded to previous treatments, and see whether they respond to MDMA-assisted psychotherapy.
Jessica?
I would love data on it, and I would say, like you said, access is an issue. So, and I don't necessarily think we need to require failing a treatment to try a different treatment, particularly for individuals who may be less willing to engage in a treatment. But I know that that's my clinical perspective. I know there's also considerations around kind of how to, given this is so resource intensive, structure things
Right.
and figure out who gets access.
Yeah, I'm not honestly even really thinking that much about how the plans would think about the cost of this. It's just that given that there are several different short-term trauma-focused psychotherapy options that have been out there and are pretty well accepted and have a fairly high success rate, it seems a little bit, I don't know, uncomfortable to think of a patient hearing about MDMA AP on social media and asking for that first, and having the insurance company say, sure, why don't we make that your first treatment? It feels like the system will go back towards accentuating the prior kind of treatment modalities. But I acknowledge the tension that creates a barrier, if you will, because there are limited access to those treatment facilities and providers. Naomi, did you want to?
Yeah, I kind of wanted to jump in. I think, up to this point, I've mostly spoken on behalf of my veterans, the over 1 million veterans that we represent as an organization. But I kind of want to speak about myself real quick. I was diagnosed with combat PTSD coming out of Iraq. It was probably about 2005, 2006, somewhere around there is when I was actually diagnosed. I went through all of the different treatments. I mean, you name it, went through it. All the conventional stuff, all the medications. You name it, I did it. Because I was so desperate for a real solution. It took some kind of expectation on my part as I was in therapy to really understand that this is not something that I can necessarily be cured from. And so, I just wanted it to now I just need to be able to function. And I had some really bad thoughts, suicidal, as well as homicidal thoughts around surrounding my PTSD, around my child, unfortunately. But anyway, I think it's important to understand that, getting to the point where you're at the end of your rope, and this could be something that really can help. That is where, and of course we don't want to, push someone to say, oh no, well, you have to wait till you're at the end of your rope to get this treatment. We don't want to go that far, but you definitely, and I agree, not getting to where it's, oh, I've been diagnosed with PTSD. Well, we'll just, slap some MDMA on it and some, psycho-assisted therapy on it and keep it moving. So I think there kind of needs to be sort of a middle there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we usually end up in conversations about how many different rounds of other treatments people have to try. One other treatment, 2, 3, 4. These are the real choices that health plans are going to be making. And that's sometimes why clinical guidelines can be very helpful, because sometimes they have suggestions around that kind of thing. Pete, I'm going to ask you in a second what you think the VA is going to do if they're going to have people try MDMA without having tried any other form of short-term trauma-focused psychotherapy or not. But Marina, back to your perspective on this. What do you think they're going to do with these other existing treatment modalities?
No, I definitely, when we surveyed payers specifically about MDMA, those that had indicated they would have some path to approval for MDMA AP, 70% indicated they would do some kind of step therapy. So whether that's through an SSRI, an atypical antipsychotic, and then in terms of trauma-focused therapy or other therapy, about half of them indicated that they would have that as part of clinical criteria. And I will say, I think that as someone who thinks a lot about behavioral health, I actually think that's a positive thing, because if it's in clinical criteria, if it's in your criteria for approval, it's almost like a path to getting that.
I know, I've seen that. I've seen that happen.
Right. So for some patients, it's almost, when you're newly diagnosed with something, there is that initial kind of frozen feeling of like, I don't know what to do and I don't know where to go. And so my hope is that, whatever happens with MDMA AP, I think it's good to talk about PTSD. I think it's good for payers to, be a little more educated about the disease, payers and all of us. And then I think that, it's good to think through the process of like, how does a patient find a psychiatrist? How does a patient, receive therapy? And so, well, yes, I know how, I acknowledge the fact that it's very difficult to kind of have the feeling of jumping through hoops. It's really just making sure that you've tried and failed kind of the proven therapies. And I do feel like perhaps it'll be a pathway to access to care.
Excellent. Pete, so just do you have any thoughts on how the VA will create its own criteria for who gets started on MDMA?
I haven't seen anything yet, but I would echo what Marina just said as a pathway, because both from an evidentiary point of view as well as from a practical point of view. The evidence, as you took those votes earlier about the level of evidence and the quality of evidence, which is, let's say, dicey, marginal at best. Whereas you have a series of therapies that are far better known. The safety profile is known of these to a far greater extent. So from that point of view alone, I think that people would want to go through, as Marina just pointed out, the quality therapies before they get to the less known, if you will, both from an efficacy and a safety point of view. But then on the other hand, you also have what Naomi was talking about, which is that there are a number of people that have probably gone through any number of different therapies and hopefully not at the end of the rope, but are really just struggling with what they have. And I would think that one would want to prioritize those folks. And then finally, as Joar pointed out, you had a number of, well, change that up a little bit. The people that were coming into these trials were highly selected. I noticed that as well, that the number of people that were chosen for therapy is much smaller than the number of people that were considered eligible or screened, which leads me to believe that a lot of the people needed other therapies anyway as a first-line therapy, or weren't applicable for this. So I think you're having both from a practical view and evidentiary point of view, long before you even get to the cost and infrastructure issue, you have reasons to emphasize well-documented and well-known therapies first. So, but I don't know what the criteria will look like, but it just makes sense to me logically from a clinical point of view.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. All right, last series of questions. I'm going to make sure that the clinical experts have their magic wands still ready, because I'm going to ask you if the NIMH were funding any kind of research that you would want them to fund, what should it be? And what should future drug makers in this kind of space think of in the future research? A couple of easy things I think have already come up. One is to test something like MDMA as an add-on to other more established psychotherapy vehicles like CBT. But you can say more about that. And then just, again, help us make kind of a cogent list of key research needs and guidance for future research from both the academic NIMH community and drug makers. So what do you think we need? What's that future research agenda? You're
asking me, Stephen?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
I would say that we primarily need two things on the research agenda. We need comparative head-to-head trials, and it would be preferable if it was in psychedelic naive patients, so that we recruit patients who have no prior history or lifetime history of psychedelic use.
mm-hmm.
And I would also like to see randomized controlled trials that use stratified randomization on assumed prognostic factors. So could MDMA-assisted psychotherapy be especially well suited for some subgroups of patients with PTSD? There are a lot of assumptions and a lot of sayings, but to my knowledge, there is very little data on this.
And thank you. Is the psychedelic naive aspect of this, is that because if they've used them in the past, they will certainly know whether they're getting it as part of the trial and it's part of the unblinding problem? Is that the main reason that you would want them to be naive?
Yeah. So
aren't they still, even if they're naive, aren't they going to have a pretty good idea of whether it's?
Yes, I think you still will have problems with the functional unblinding issue.
Right.
But I think that you might recruit patients with a bit of different expectations before they go into the trial. So if you compare prolonged exposure, for example, to say some form of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, we should try to balance out expectations effects in the arms of the trial, right? And I worry that there are substantial differences in the expectations effects in the current MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trials.
Okay, great. Jessica, what does your research portfolio look like?
Mm-hmm. So I definitely echo Joar's point about we really need rigorous research, both combining MDMA with trauma-focused therapy and then also comparing it with standard trauma-focused therapy. I think too, we need research on a lot of the questions that are being asked today as far as this being resource intensive. So like, are multiple therapists needed in each appointment? Are multiple dosings needed for each patient? Given that, you know, if you can not do 3 dosing sessions, obviously that helps with scalability. I'll again echo Joar's point about research looking at prognostic factors and predictors of response and non-response. So trying to really characterize, there's a lot of clinical opinions, but what does the data actually tell us about who's a good fit with MDMA therapy, and what are some of those, are there some patients who might need more or less, whether it's dosing or as well as integration sessions. And then another thing that I think is really important is doing some more data collection on therapeutic mechanisms. So there's a lot of discussion about the potential mechanisms of MDMA, but there's not a lot of rigorous data actually collected on it, and seeing if it's actually associated with outcome. And right now, kind of what happens in therapy sessions is kind of a black box. So actually getting data on that to look at mechanisms. And I think also, to echo the patient experiences earlier, that also is an ethical and safety safeguard, making sure that all patients are treated appropriately and ethically, but also being able to do things like, you know, observational coding of like the therapeutic process and potential mechanisms of change, so that we can figure out how to really optimize these treatments.
Awesome. And Naomi and Diana, do you guys have any thoughts on, if you were advising the research projects, you know, for the future types of research being done? Any specific needs that you would see that would be nice to have?
I think it'd be really interesting to see it being broken down a little bit more into the different types of traumas people might be coming in with. Like I know someone mentioned before, like, are we talking about veterans? Are we talking about like sexual assault survivors? What sort of like, you know, that I think definitely will be interesting to see. Another thing is I would really love to see the way that this plays in those multicultural contexts, but also especially with regards to language. And the reason I say that is because I'm thinking about how a lot of these places come from maybe linguistically isolated households, or when you look at a lot of the literature around it, you're telling people they need to be educated. But how are they going to be educated if there's these complicated, whether that be pharmacological terms that even like someone who's very fluent in English might not fully understand, much less someone who is struggling a bit. And just having more, I would love to see the way that the research might change, or like the results might change depending on the way that people are empowered in their own patient journeys across this as they are going through the process.
Thank you. That's great.
I
Naomi, would you like
Yes,
to?
I definitely echo what Diana said about multicultural, diverse populations. VA has a formidable health research network, and I definitely want to see women veterans included in there. As we know, they have traditionally, you know, up until just the last few decades were not even included in VA research. And so definitely women veterans, MST versus combat PTSD, you know, MST related PTSD and combat related PTSD. And then other medical conditions, comorbidities, as you mentioned, Steve, yes, that's a very real thing. When we talk about service disabled veterans, you know, if a veteran presents before VA, it is very likely that they're not coming just for a mental health issue. They're dealing with chronic pain. They're dealing with, you know, other different comorbidities, you know, hypertension, which, as we know, is contraindicated for MDMA. So, you know, these are just different things that I would like to see included in that research.
Oh, and then one more thing which I forgot to mention is also like, I know if it was mentioned, like, you know, people should not be using other drugs outside of this, which makes perfect sense from a clinical perspective. But I'm also thinking about how the rate of young adults using psychedelics has been going up over the last few years, and how we also saw in the report there was at least one case of someone who was recommended to continue taking their own supply of MDMA after the trials concluded. So with these things in mind, I think it would be interesting and important to see maybe sort of like what you were mentioning as well, like what are the histories people have with these access or usage of these types of drugs, that expectation, that knowledge base people are coming in with, especially, yeah, with that in mind.
Guys, thank you. That was a really rich conversation. I appreciate it. I think we got a lot out of it to help bring a kind of a policy closure around the discussions of evidence today. Not closure in the sense of things being finalized, but a sense that this all fits in a broader policy context. And you guys have been great at bringing that out. I want to offer each of you a chance to make a final statement, as we say. We always ask people to limit it to one sentence with a strategically placed comma or semicolon. And it can be anything about something that you've already said and you just want to make sure you hammer it home. It can be the one thing you haven't said that you want to get on the table. It can be just whatever message you want to leave people with. And I also would encourage you to think of it, the possibility of making it a request. And it could be a request of any of the stakeholders, patients, clinicians, specialty societies, drug makers, payers. If you would want to frame a request to them to do something different so that the future for the treatment of people with PTSD would be improved, feel free to frame your final statement that way. So take a deep breath and think about what you might want to say. I am going to give the patients the last word. So I'm going to start with Pete.
Yeah, I was afraid you might do that. No, I think having been a VA provider now in primary care and palliative care for, I don't even, almost 30 years, I think, or over, I've seen a lot of suffering through PTSD. So clearly we all want to have better treatments and more access to those treatments as time goes on. So I just encourage, I don't think I have to say this to the people here, but I just encourage in general openness when it comes to thinking about new modalities and new methods for getting PTSD treatment to people. So I'm very big on this, but I'm trying to, and keeping an open mind in the face of change.
Thank you very much. Marina?
Sure. So I think that I'll just say that while there are risks to MDMA therapy, there's also a risk to leaving patients with severe PTSD without additional therapy choices, because as we heard today, it forces them to seek out unapproved therapies. So I really look forward to seeing future research and innovation in PTSD, and also additional education. I think like discussions like this are so wonderful just to kind of educate ourselves and kind of have, the back and forth. And I will say, I think that should the FDA approve this agent, it's likely there will be a very stringent REMS. And I think that payers, again, will struggle initially with how to operationalize coverage and management of MDMA-AP. But again, I think it'll be rocky at first, but payers and prescribers will figure out how to weave this agent into the treatment of PTSD, while at the same time figuring out how to minimize fraud, waste, and abuse. And again, hopefully in a way that allows equity of access and appropriate safety protections for all of the patients that are appropriate for therapy with MDMA-AP.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. You are.
So one sentence is difficult, Stephen.
I know.
Taking a medical conservative perspective, I would say that my reading of the evidence for MDMA is the psychotherapy aligns very well with the conclusion of the ICER report. I think the evidence as it currently stands is insufficient, and I would see more high quality research on this treatment option.
Thank you. Jessica?
I'm thinking about your kind of ask, you were saying, so something that came to mind for me is, these are potentially really powerful treatments, and remembering that it's MDMA assisted therapy and the importance of moving forward, how important therapy is to this process, and rigorous research standards for psychotherapy research, and, in acknowledgement of the patient's bravery, earlier today, for those who are in positions who might be related to how these things are rolled out, just keeping in mind and prioritizing the importance of training and oversight and ensuring that therapists are doing a appropriate job in these models.
Great. Thanks again very much. Naomi?
Well, first, I want to thank you so much for, keeping us in the conversation, us being veterans, and to just remember that there are veterans like me out there that do have treatment-resistant PTSD, as they call it, that could use something that is potentially going to help them in a safe and effective and ethical manner that would be delivered by VA, but and that really to make sure, I really want to make sure that our diverse veteran population is included in further research to make sure that, we do, as I said earlier, continue to receive first quality, high class, evidence-based healthcare.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for the work that you do. Diana?
Yeah, thank you for including us. And, I was really worried at first about if I'm emphasizing certain points too much, but I think it's important to remember that the US is heading very well on a track that within the next 10 years or so, it's going to be a minority majority. I think the majority of the US population will be non-white. And so that's why it's so important that for me, that I don't let those points go undiscussed. And why at the end of the day, we can talk about these different treatments and how much we need hope for the field. And I think at the core of it is we want to be seen as human beings, as people deserving of empowerment and empathy, and most importantly, dignity, autonomy. And so I hope these discussions continue to have this sort of patient centricity around it, because no one wants to just feel like a case to be solved by slapping some sticker label on and be like, okay, you're done. So thank you for including us.
Oh, you're so welcome. And thank you for being so eloquent. All of you, Naomi and Diana also, just, a lot of courage has been shown in today's comments, but your guys bringing your voice to this conversation is really essential to everything that we can get right going forward. So thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to hand it at this point. I hope you can stay, because you're likely to hear positive feedback from the New England CEPAC as they have a chance to give their final comments. But I'll hand it back over to Jason to walk through that.
Thank you so much, Steve. So we're going to go through in a similar way through the CEPAC Voting Council and offer a generous sentence as a closing statement. So let me go through in the same order as I began. I'll start with Dr. Rob Asselheim.
Thank you, Jason. Well, I just want to thank everyone for what has been a very difficult but interesting and I think important discussion. The one thing I want to emphasize is just the critical importance of good research to bring these potential therapies to market and to patients. I know that it is very difficult to deal with issues around blinding with treatments like this, but it's not that difficult to deal with quality outcome measures and good research design. And we definitely need to be doing that, because as a mental health researcher, I'll say there's a great deal of hope out there in these, but we need good evidence.
Thank you so much. Dr. Austin Fracht.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks to everyone for a great meeting. Really following on to what Rob said, when I see trials like this that have a kind of conduct issues that have come to light, and some of the procedural issues that are concerning, this is not just these don't just become issues for this particular patient population. The issue I'm thinking about is for everyone. There is a real reputational risk to clinical trials in general when you see a clinical trial in particular not well done, for things that are controllable. And I would say perhaps on the table for the FDA is some agency risk. I don't know if they consider that, but I would be worried about that if I were them.
Thank you, Austin. Rebecca Kirsch.
I'll express gratitude as well for the different expertise of lived experience that we heard today. It always is beyond valuable, as Steve and Sarah both said. We all do. Thank you. I think I'm struck with mental health illness in my family by the importance of this new line of therapy. And again, reinforcing the importance of really good, rigorous research to open the door to these opportunities. And so I just head and heart in hand with the lived experience and the clinical experts today who are doing incredible work to help advance what people need for PTSD and other forms of mental illness. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Steve Kogan.
Thanks, and my gratitude as well to the patients and experts who really, so important to our process today. Can't thank you enough. Also, extend what Rob and Austin were saying about this idea about hopeful expectation about how new therapeutics may work and, how that bias may, occur in drug development. And it strikes me this isn't only isolated to manufacturers. I think we saw this in the public health realm with COVID vaccines and therapeutics, where there's a lot of hope and expectation. And, it seems the best way to guard against this bias is by deeply evaluating the design and conduct of trials. And this has always been fundamental to ICER's process. And I think the importance of this was really showcased today. So thanks to ICER for that.
Thank you, Don Kreis.
Thank you. As someone who's here as a representative of families that have been affected by serious illnesses, it's important that I not be perceived as being complicit in efforts to exploit or manipulate or harm people who are suffering and who yearn for help. And I want to assure people like Sarah McNamee and Lily Ross and Megan Buisson that they have been heard here. Moreover, regardless of whether a drug company brands itself as a public benefit corporation, a pharma firm that lacks the integrity to engage with our process gets no respect, no deference from me, regardless of any good work it might have done. I hope to see the day when ICER issues a favorable report on the cost effectiveness of a so-called psychedelic medication, but regrettably, today is not that day. Nevertheless, thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Don. Dr. Julie Coopers.
I wanted to echo everyone's sentiments as well as just thanking the expertise on this call. This being my first CEPAC call, taking in all of this information, a little bit overwhelming at first, but it was wonderful to hear the perspectives of the clinical experts, of the patients, having a chance to really read through and digest all of the evidence and talk it through with this group has been very helpful. And I too look forward to seeing some sort of treatment really geared towards PTSD that will work effectively, and somehow being able to control for some of the confounding variables that we talked about today. Although I too felt like today was not that day, but I remain hopeful for the future.
Thank you. Dr. Lavelle, Tara Lavelle.
Yeah, just want to echo everyone who, expressed gratitude. I thought the ICER team, Dr. McQueen, Dr. Mustafa did an incredible job with a very hard evaluation, and thanks for all the patients and patient advocates that stepped forward. I think just, thinking about how they are really, I think just like we talked about, a population that really needs a therapy, and the fact that they are advocating for this therapy, I think shows the risks that they're willing to take, given that they really have suffered with this disease. But I really think that we need to do a better job making sure that studies are conducted ethically and rigorously, and make sure that that evidence is, sufficient to, implement more broadly. So thanks, everyone. It's been a very, very interesting meeting.
Thank you. Aaron, Dr. Mitchell.
So I think my own personal take or version of agreement with ICER's evidence rating in the report is that it's striking how strong and far apart the potential hopes and the potential worries and like truly potential fears are regarding this therapy. It's remarkable how polar they are from each other, and it's remarkable how strong in this case they both remain even after we've seen the results of the trials.
Thank you. And next is Dr. Stephanie Nichols.
Thanks. I would love to ditto what Aaron said, but I'll also add, I'm very appreciative of the patient expertise as well as our clinical expertise. I think that was really, really helpful in the discussions and deliberations. I echo what many people said about the need for more rigorous trials, and particularly when we're talking about more new and novel therapeutics, and particularly when we're talking about using them in very vulnerable populations, and also in populations of people that tend to be very heterogeneous, both from like etiology, but also demographics we've talked about and other factors. But I also remain hopeful, and I look forward to more evidence about treatment effect and safety in the future. And so that's where I land. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Joe Porter.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, struck just by the amount of work that went into this meeting by the ICER team and the amount of energy and emotion that came forward in the patient testimony. So really appreciate that. And I'm really left with both the need that we have for, better science and better understanding for future therapies, but I'm still struck by the idea that how little access there is to even our existing good therapies for populations. So I'm feeling like we're leaving this with a bit of a call to action for not just better therapies, but better access to existing therapies. And I think that should be something that we all continue to strive through, in addition to, pushing forward on this modality and getting better evidence around it. So thank you all very much for my first meeting, which was really, really interesting and powerful. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Joe Ross. We have two Joes now.
Well, thank you to everybody for putting this event together. It was a real honor. It's for my first meeting to be a part of this, especially to Dr. Mustafa and her team for doing the evidence review, as well as the clinical experts and all of the patients in the community who participated. There's obviously a lot to learn, and I look forward to continuing to engage in ICER going forward.
Thank you. Dr. Jean Ryer.
Well, so this is my last meeting, and in 10 years, I have to say this has been the most challenging. Both on not so much for I so appreciate the rigor of the content, and that's always present, but the really challenging emotional overlay of a condition that is so prevalent and so painful with so many comorbidities, so little access, and then we have a trial that, in my view, is ethically challenged to the point that it makes me squeamish. And I'm sorry to kind of call that out so bluntly, but I guess if it's my last call, I can do that, right, Steve? Sarah, you can fire me now. So I do want to assure that, so I appreciate our clinical experts, and I have learned so much. And I want to assure our commenters and our patient representatives that you were really very heard in my heart. I will not be the same. And we have to make a collective decision about whether we're going to allow this status quo to continue as it is. And I personally will say that I will not. So I wish you all good work ahead, CEPAC. You have a lot to do. Thank you.
Jean, it's just been so fun serving with you over the years, and thank you for everything, and thank you for all you've done for the health of people throughout northern rural New England. Jason Schwartz, Dr. Jason Schwartz.
Thanks, Jason, and thanks to everyone involved in the meeting today. So many interesting and important issues raised and thoughtfully discussed, as ICER always does. And all those issues remind us, again, as everyone has acknowledged, of the importance of high quality evidence, which ultimately serves everyone involved in the health system well, most especially patients. We don't have that high quality evidence here, it seems, and that's a missed opportunity that I hope is acknowledged and addressed ultimately to advance the well-being and health of the communities we've heard from today. So thank you again.
Thank you. Rishi, Dr. Wadera.
I just thanks to the ICER team and the patient representatives and the clinical experts. This is just a really illuminating and an informative discussion. And one thing I really appreciated actually was the fact that diverse perspectives were showcased, sometimes falling almost on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And it was sort of that frontline perspective along with the empirical perspective, which I think sometimes we miss out on that frontline perspective and focus just on the high level empirical evidence. And I think both together are really, really important. So I was very appreciative of that. And I think it helped, like many people have alluded to in this situation, I think randomization doesn't always mean great evidence. And I think we probably saw a good example of that here. So thank you again for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Rishi. I'll conclude just by saying, thank you to the ICER staff and the consultants for generating such an amazing, detailed report, rigorous report. I leave this day so impressed about the extraordinary suffering that so many individuals with a history of trauma and PTSD have faced, and how deep our societal commitment needs to be, not only in terms of evidence generation, but also in terms of the provision of healthcare services. That we've heard so much about the spotty access to psychiatry care, to psychologists, to different types of therapists. And given the extraordinary burden of disease and suffering that we've seen so clearly today in such vivid demonstration, we need to all commit to supporting individuals with PTSD to accessing the services they need and having adequate access to evidence to understand the therapies that will work best for them. I'm privileged to have chaired this meeting, and we'll turn it over to Dr. Pearson.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you, everybody. First, CEPAC, again, you guys, as a group, create an environment and a forum through which we can have these kinds of discussions. And the way that you brought, your intellect to bear in thinking about the studies and the evidence, and the way that you also introduced the variety of perspectives, ethical and otherwise, really brought humanity to the day as well. So I want to really thank the New England CEPAC. And Jean, you know how I respect your contributions over the years. We're going to miss you terribly. It's been wonderful. Our policy roundtable, again, I just have to say again, you also created a real opportunity for us all to learn, and you were so generous and open-minded with your own perspectives. It made us feel comfortable to talk about difficult things, and you were great guides to the different perspectives that we hope all decision makers will take forward in this space, whether it's around research or insurance coverage or whatever it might be. You guys are great guides to that. ICER staff, also thank you for tremendous work on this report and for the conduct of this meeting. And lastly, I have to come back to the public commenters. I think I probably already thanked them for their courage, but it really does take courage to do what they did, each and every one of them. And I'm very proud that we have a forum in which we can have these kinds of conversations in public, in which difficult issues can be brought together with considerations around evidence and trials, because the context in this case is it's more important than anything else. And the one thing that also that I think the public comments helped reaffirm was, and I remember, I was taking an ethics course in professionalism, quote unquote, years ago. And the question was, why do professionals have any special ethical duties? And if so, why? Why do doctors, nurses, to a certain extent, lawyers, why do professionals, do they have special ethical kind of requirements? And the answer is yes. And the reason is because we are confronted with the job of helping people who are vulnerable. And vulnerability creates a special ethical requirement among professionals. And that extends to companies who work with people who are ill, both insurers and life science companies. And we heard today stories in which that vulnerability was abused in a variety of different ways. And that's very, very troubling. But it also reminds us all that to do well by people who are ill, we have to acknowledge their vulnerability, have to treat them with dignity, but we also have to remember that they convey upon us a special ethical duty to serve them. And so I really hope that the product of this report and this meeting will do that, will serve the people who live with PTSD and the people who care for them. And that is my biggest hope, greatest hope for the product of this meeting. And again, all of you have contributed to what I think will be our ability to do that. So thank you to you all. We will be putting out, I think we have one last slide that says we'll be putting out our final report on or around June 27th, in which we will try our best to capture the richness of this conversation and translate it through into some policy perspectives. And we again hope that we will be with you in the future to talk about further evidence, further trials, and further opportunities to help people with PTSD around the country. Thank you very much, everybody. Be well.